JPEG versus RAW. It's an argument that's been going on for 25 years. Which one's better? Well, today I'm not going to answer that question. What I'm going to do instead is compare like for like JPEG files and RAW files in Lightroom and edit them, and we're going to see for our own eyes the differences between the two. So join me today as we don't answer the question, which is better, RAW or JPEG? So the purpose of today is to simply have a look at RAW and JPEG files in Lightroom and edit them. We're going to look at things like overexposure and recovering highlights. We're going to look at underexposure and noise levels when recovering shadows. We're going to look at white balance. I'm also going to look at compression and color depth and see how that actually affects the image quality between RAW and JPEG. So let's get into it right now. And we're going to look first of all at white balance. Now, white balance is one of the biggest differences between JPEG and RAW files. In a JPEG, if you set the white balance in your camera, that white balance is baked into your image. If you shoot a RAW, that white balance can be changed at any time and accurately, exactly as if it had been changed in camera. It's a big difference, and we're going to have a look at that on screen right now. So here we are in Lightroom, and I've got a whole batch of RAW files and JPEGs, all taken at exactly the same time as RAW JPEG files. And I've color-coded the RAW files green and I've color-coded the JPEG files red to make it easier to differentiate. Now let's have a look at the white balance. This is a RAW file and we're going to take it over into the develop module. And in the develop module, you can't see it on screen, but I can actually change the temperature of that image. However, if I go over to the JPEG, it simply allows me to change the temperature as a plus or minus. It doesn't actually allow me to change the color temperature. Now, if I whack this color temperature, let's say down -50, and you can see it makes everything blue. It's the sky's gone blue, the grass has gone blue, the building's gone blue, the whole thing's gone blue. If I come back to the JPEG and do a similar amount of manipulation with the color temperature going towards the blue side of the scale, you can see that it does go blue and it looks colder, but we still maintain greens and other colors in the correct places. There's not an overall cast to it, there's a coolness to it. And if we go to the JPEG, you can see it's much more blue than the reduced color temperature. This means that in a RAW file, we can change that white balance. We can change it from a temperature that I have here of around 3,500, and we can go much warmer up to say 8,000 or 9,000. You still maintain the original coloring, but you just make the image warmer. Whereas if I go the other way on the JPEG version, everything changes color. The grass has gone yellow and the buildings have gone yellow. Everything is yellow. So you have much more flexibility in a RAW file to change that white balance after you've taken the image. So that demonstrates the difference in being able to change the white balance in camera with a JPEG or a RAW file. Now we're going to have a look at one of the other big differences between JPEG and RAW, and that is dynamic range, and in particular highlight recovery. Now, a RAW file by its very nature reports every part of the image to the sensor and allows you to manipulate all that raw data from the sensor. A JPEG, on the other hand, will bake in certain aspects. It will bake in a color profile, it will bake in sharpness, it will bake in contrast and saturation. That makes it a little bit more difficult to edit if you want to push the file further, and it makes it quite difficult to bring back blown highlights. Now, whilst it's quite easy to expose and capture those highlights in a JPEG by bringing that exposure down, you are then at risk of making the shadows too dark, and we'll look at that in the next section. But for this section, we're going to look at a couple of overexposed JPEG and RAW files and see how different they are when you try to recover the highlights. And first of all, we're going to look at highlights. And for that, I've got these two images here, which are relatively overexposed. Now, if I pull this one up and bring it into the develop module, you can see that I've got some clipping in this. This is the RAW file. If I hover my mouse over the highlight indicator here, you can see that there is some highlights that have clipped out. Now, if I come to the JPEG version, that area of highlights that have blown is much greater for the same exposure. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the RAW and we're just going to pull those highlights down by using the highlights slider. Just to about there. And then we're going to bring the image down to make it look less underexposed. So we'll bring that in like that. And there we go. And I'm going to do the same with the JPEG here. We're going to bring those highlights down. Now, at this point, it looks like we've recovered those highlights and everything's tickety-boo. However, if I bring that exposure down to match it similar to the RAW file, you will see that we haven't recovered those highlights. And if I bring this exposure down further, you can see that we've got a great big burnt out hole here, whereas in the RAW version, we don't. If I bring that exposure down, everything should look fairly even and we don't have that big burnt out hole. You can see that there's a recovery in those highlights there. These are relatively small censored files from a DJI drone. It's a 1-inch sensor, which really highlights this issue with the dynamic range and recapturing the highlights. I chose this because the dynamic range is significantly lower in these cameras and it really highlights the difference between pulling back the highlights in a RAW and pulling back the highlights in a JPEG. So as I mentioned in the previous section, whilst you can bring the exposure down on a JPEG to bring those highlights down, you're in danger of crushing the blacks or crushing the shadow areas. So in this section, we're going to have a little look at bringing the shadows up, both in an underexposed RAW and an underexposed JPEG file. We're going to see just how different the shadow noise is. So let's get into Lightroom and have a look at shadow noise. So now let's have a look at shadow recovery. And for that, I've got these two images here. Again, RAW and JPEG. The RAW file and the JPEG are exactly the same exposure and they are underexposed. I'm going to take the RAW file first, we'll take it over into the develop module and I'm simply going to bring the shadows all the way up to +100. And as you can see, it's brought the shadows up nicely. If I zoom in, there is noise and it is quite noisy. This is a base ISO of 100, but it is quite noisy having brought those shadows up. If, however, I go over to the JPEG version of this file and I whack the shadows up to 100, we get a very similar result to the RAW file. And you can see there's hardly any difference there. However, if I zoom in, that image has broken up quite a lot more. There's significantly more noise in this JPEG than there is in that RAW file. And there's another advantage to the RAW here. If I go to Lightroom's denoise in JPEG, it's actually blanked out and I can't use it. However, if I go to that same denoise in RAW and press the denoise, let's enhance the data, bring it up, we'll give it a 30% denoise. And there we go. Now, if we zoom in, this is the one that's had the noise reduced. This is the RAW, which we reduced the noise from originally. So you can see there's quite a big difference there. And then if we go to the JPEG, there's even more noise. So we can use AI noise reduction in Lightroom on RAWs, but we cannot use them on JPEGs. Now, one of the most misunderstood and least recognized issues is color bit depth. Now, when you record a JPEG, it records 8-bit for each channel. So 8-bit for green, 8-bit for red, 8-bit for blue. So a total of 24 bits. And that allows an image to have approximately 16 million different variations on color. And that seems like a lot. It's a sort of difference that we probably couldn't perceive with our eye. However, when you push an image, you do see it. Now, RAW files are typically 12 to 14-bit per channel. That means at 12-bit, you have 68 billion different colors that can be created. And at 14-bit, that number runs into the trillions. That is an absolute phenomenal amount of color range that you can capture and a significant difference to JPEG. Now, out of the camera, that's not going to show up. However, when you push those images in editing and when you compress those images, perhaps to put them on the web, that's really going to show up. So let's have a look in Lightroom again and have a look at the difference between an 8-bit and a 14-bit image when compressed. Now, to demonstrate the bit depth and color flexibility, these two images here are JPEG. However, the one that's green was originally a RAW, and I've done minor edits on the RAW to match it to the JPEG. And what I've done is I've saved both of these images full size, but at 25% compression in JPEG. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up the images and see how much that has affected the color banding in the images. So if I open up the JPEG, you can see it doesn't look too bad, but if I zoom in, there is definitely some banding in the sky. That's caused by the compression of the JPEG. You can also see the compression in the JPEG here. Now, this is the original RAW file saved at 25%. If I go to the JPEG, you can see if I zoom in, not only is there more banding in the sky where the color differentiates between the blues, but there's also compression artifacts in the sky, much more so than we had on the RAW file. So you can see that there is a significant difference between compressing a RAW down to a JPEG and compressing a JPEG further down into a new JPEG. Now, this is particularly significant when you're putting stuff up online and you want images to load faster. You're still going to get a better quality if you've got an edited RAW saved as a JPEG than if you save that JPEG down, because you're actually saving a JPEG a second time and increasing that compression and the color banding. So that was quite interesting, and as you could see, the JPEG really didn't hold up quite as well as the RAW. Now we're going to look at something a little different, and that's the editing profiles. When you take an image in JPEG, it's quite possible that you could put your camera into a particular profile, landscape, portrait. If you're using Fuji cameras, you have the Fuji film simulations, and what they do is they bake in a certain color look to your image. With RAW, you don't get that. However, when you go into editing and into your Lightroom or whatever editing suite that you're using, you can add those color profiles in post. Lightroom adds the color profiles for various cameras into its color section in the develop section, and you can apply that profile. If you run a preset on a JPEG, you're going to run up to the problems that we mentioned earlier with the banding and the breaking up of the image. Whereas on a RAW, that's not going to happen to such a great degree. It may well happen, but you can dial back that profile a little bit to stop it breaking up. Let's have a look in Lightroom at applying a couple of presets to a RAW and a JPEG and see what difference it actually makes to those images. So back in the library module, these two images up here were taken on a Sony Alpha 7 R5. The green one is the RAW, the JPEG is in red. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them over to the develop module. And we'll start with the RAW file. As you can see, it's a little bit flatter. Now, with the RAW file, I can go over to the develop module and change the profile to any profile that I like. So if I pick, for example, the Adobe landscape, you can see there's a very slight color change, but I can actually change it. I'll put it back to Adobe color, which was the standard. If we go over to the JPEG, I can't change those color profiles. That's already baked in the camera and it cannot be changed. The only thing I can change is black and white or color. Presets can also have a major effect on the way an image looks, and you have much more control on a RAW if you're applying a preset. So let's go over and just pick a random preset from here. We're going to use the Adaptive Sky preset, and we're going to use Dark Drama because that's going to add a whole lot of interest into the sky. And as you can see, it doesn't look great in the RAW. It does look quite contrived and it is quite noisy. However, if I apply that same thing to the JPEG file, the effect is more dramatic, the noise is greater, and the banding is greater. And this is the issue with presets. Because a preset is pushing the image, it has more latitude to be able to do that with a RAW file than it does with a JPEG. Now, as I said at the top, I don't mean this video to be anti-RAW or anti-JPEG. What it is trying to explain the differences, and at the moment you've probably noticed that RAW is coming out better, particularly as an editing file. But JPEG does have advantages. The first one is its file size. It is significantly smaller than the equivalent RAW. So to quickly show the difference here between file size of a JPEG and a RAW, I've got two identical images taken at exactly the same time. And as you can see at the moment, they're in icon view. And if I go over to list view here, and we'll just bring this details in, you can see there is a significant difference in size. The JPEG is 17 megapixels. It's quite a complex image, so that complexity means that there's more information in it, which means the JPEG is probably bigger than many would be. So that's 17 megapixel. The RAW file, the files are generally pretty much identical in size, and this is an uncompressed Sony RAW 61 megapixel, and you can see that's 129 megabytes compared to 17 megabytes. That's a huge difference, particularly when you're editing and particularly if you're limited on space either on your SD card or on your hard drives at home. It's a major difference and a major consideration. Now, because of that file size, it also records to your media much quicker. It records to your SD card or CF card much quicker, which means your buffer doesn't fill up so quick. It means you can shoot faster in continuous mode, get more images. That makes it ideal for sports and wildlife where you're really trying to pump out as many images as you can to nail the perfect shot. When importing, it imports so much quicker. And when editing, if you're not pushing the files too far, it edits so much quicker. It's so much easier to move quickly through JPEG files, edit very slightly, move on to the next one. If you've got a slower computer, an older computer, JPEG will make a huge difference when compared to RAW files when editing. Another aspect is that you can go quickly to social media shooting a JPEG. With a RAW, you've got to edit it before you put it online. With a JPEG, you might be able to upload it straight to the camera app on your phone and up to social media and get that out there very quickly. That's really useful flexibility. So RAW takes more space, takes more time, but gives you much greater editing flexibility. Whilst JPEG is smaller, faster, gives you less editing flexibility, but will be better where you're shooting action or if you need to get those files out very quickly to social media, to a client, as previews. If you're shooting to create large prints that are going on walls or commercial work, then RAW is probably the way to go. However, for many people, if you're not wanting to edit or print large or do major work to that image, then JPEG is probably a better option for you, and particularly if you don't have a lot of space or computing power. So in summary, RAW, you get more dynamic range, you can change the white balance, and it's more editable. JPEG, smaller, faster, doesn't need as much editing because a lot of the work is baked into it already and you can get it out the door much quicker. So I hope that's helped explain some of the practical differences between RAW and JPEG. So some of the arguments online about what's better, RAW or JPEG, are absolutely bizarre. Neither is perfect and neither is right or wrong. Both are very good file formats for what they are. It's really down to your workflow, what you shoot and what you want to do with a file that determines whether you shoot JPEG or RAW. Personally, I shoot both, and many cameras these days will allow you to do that. It gives me the flexibility of getting a JPEG out quickly, or it gives me the flexibility of editing a really nice file in a RAW in Lightroom and making a really good job of it for a print later on. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've got any questions or comments about JPEG versus RAW, let me know down below. Let me know which one you prefer and why. I'd be really interested to see if there's some aspects that I've missed out that you might be able to add to this. If you've enjoyed the video, a like would be fantastic, a sub would be even better, and I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.